So thank you for attending our PDS Virtual Connect Cybersecurity panel. Hello, everyone. My name is Tamara Corbell. I am the Executive Director of Enterprise Products and Solutions here at PDS, as well as I represent the CISO for our organization. Today, we have three individuals with a deep background in cybersecurity, and I would like to welcome all three of you to our panel. Let's start with Nick, just providing a background of your skill sets and your history of cybersecurity.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. So cybersecurity has been sort of deep, of interest to me for many years, and near and dear to my heart. I've been involved in many aspects of this part of the industry, from building products to being a Gartner analyst for a period of time, helping organizations address their problems in this space, as well as being on the consulting side and actually delivering solutions. So this is, I think, an area that is very vibrant and is very critical for business as we carry things forward, especially as we start to focus on how we can take advantage of all these capabilities and provide digital transformation to organizations wanting to leverage the benefits of cloud and mobility and so forth, while still maintaining the security and reducing the risk that those opportunities entail.
Thank you, Nick. Alex.
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity to come chat today. I really appreciate it. So my name is Alex Riles. I'm the VP of the cybersecurity business here at Tech Data for North America. So Tech Data, of course, being a global IT distributor, we buy technology from our great manufacturers, like from Jonathan here, who he'll introduce himself in a minute, but we distribute to our partners like PDS, and we train and enable our partners on cybersecurity skills. We do all the quoting for partners who need quotes for their customers, and we also build solutions in my organization, solutions that help the channel be successful in selling cybersecurity solutions. And we also tie pretty tightly into the industry analyst community, so that we're constantly collecting research and data about cybersecurity to help our customers understand where the threats are and how they can mitigate them. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Alex. Jonathan.
Hey, many thanks for allowing me to be here today. My name is Jonathan Nguyen. I'm a vice president and a field CISO at Fortinet. We are the largest pure play cybersecurity company in the industry, with a really broad and large portfolio that we call the Fortinet Security Fabric. And it's all about edge-to-edge security solutions with a special emphasis on secure SD-WAN and SASE. So looking forward to the discussion. I've been in security, gosh, since the dawn of time, some 25 years ago, when we were still talking about signature-based detections and packet filtering firewalls. I've always been in that space. I wrote one of the first business cases for managed security services, and I spent about 16 years at one of the largest carriers and their MSSP leadership team. And I spent 2 years running that data breach investigations team. So I had a lot of insight across some 12,000 data breaches, and my job is basically applying all those hard-learned lessons using that Fortinet Security Fabric with our partners. That some of them are on this call. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. A few questions. So as far as COVID-19 and the impact that it's had to all different types of industry, what would the recommendation be for having a discussion with within an organization and to ensure really how to protect data? I think what it comes down to, from a security perspective, ensuring that data is protected. Where would you start that discussion? Maybe Jonathan, you could start.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing before any technology decision is made is to understand what it is, what's the object of the exercise? What exactly are you trying to protect? And so doing your data and process classification, understand what you own, its criticality, and what the underlying dependencies are key. But the pandemic really accelerated a lot of the macro trends that we saw going into that situation, right? So certainly networks are borderless. Computing and networking has accelerated greatly, and the level of complexity has really grown. But the fundamental thing that it really did was shift our workforces. There were two huge tectonic shifts in the pandemic. First is towards remote working and distributed computing, because for the first time in any of our lives, more than 90% of our teams are now working outside that enterprise perimeter. So zero trust is now a pretty big issue. And the second thing is that we've had a simultaneous mass adoption of centralized computing called cloud computing. And typically we have one or the other, but we never have two things like that happening simultaneously. So it's added a large amount of complexity. So as you said, if we're discussing or having that conversation about cybersecurity and protecting the information, you're spot on. Security today is not about behind the perimeter or in front of the firewall. It's about ensuring that security is built in wherever the computing is happening, wherever the data is being generated, and wherever it's being used. And so we look at security as being on the LAN edge, on the WAN edge, and indeed in the cloud edge now.
Thank you. Nick, your perspective.
So I couldn't agree more. And in my role as Vice President of Strategy at Micro Focus, I talk to a lot of different customers, and in particular, just over the last 6 months or so, around how this has really impacted their ability to do business. And so this adoption of remote work has been such a new shift. I mean, some may have dabbled in it, but many were not really prepared for what this really means. And so that ends up bringing in all sorts of different aspects of, whereas collaboration tools were useful before, they're critical now. And that starts to lead up to all sorts of other issues that they start running into. And I think that, you were spot on when you were talking about, really redoubling the efforts on data discovery and data classification, because the data is being distributed in all sorts of new ways. And having a good handle on what kind of data you have and where it may reside, and recognizing that, especially in this kind of remote work environment, that this can be in all sorts of different places. It can be on laptops, it can be in less secure environments than what you were expecting. And a lot of organizations that haven't had the opportunity to really prepare for that are now starting to struggle with, remote workers dealing with sensitive data, and how to make sure that the right protective controls are put in place around that. And sure, some of the tools already have some aspects of security that can be leveraged to facilitate that, but it really takes a plan. And overall, being able to go through the process, and I mean, we know what the right steps are. I mean, this hasn't changed, but putting it into action more effectively, especially in such a distributed model, is really the challenge now. And really making sure that you can follow all of the aspects of knowing what where the data is, what kind of data it is, what kind of sensitivity it has, and then applying the appropriate security controls around that, whether it's encryption controls or whether it's access controls, to ensure that only appropriate people are engaging with that data, and really being mindful of the sensitivities there. And then also, employing proper data stewardship, practices as well, in the sense of making sure that if you don't need to have the data, have the right processes in place to effectively dispose of that data in a secure fashion, and treat the data responsibly. So all of these things that we've been talking about for actually some time now really hit home, because of the nature of how distributed and how much of this is really outside of the normal environment of the corporate data center.
Thank you, Nick. Alex?
Yeah, I agree with everything Jonathan and Nick said around the mitigation strategy against threat from loss of data and protecting data. We need security controls in place, but maybe I'll shift my answer a little more to something we haven't talked about yet, because I agree with everything they said. But when we think about the threat of against our data, people tend to go quickly to something like ransomware, and that is one common threat that's become very pervasive, especially in industries like healthcare and financial services. But ransomware mitigation is something that companies have to really have a discussion around and think about. What are they going to do? What's your action plan? What's your incident response plan if that were to happen? Do you have good backup and recovery? Have you tested it recently and regularly to make sure that it's going to work? But not just ransomware, there's a data breach aspect that is also super important now with so much data theft and leakage out in the market. You can go on the dark web and buy data from almost any industry and a lot of different companies today. So companies have to think about the controls they're putting into place, as Nick and Jonathan talked about, to mitigate against those threats specifically. And governance and compliance is how we typically would approach that, thinking about access to data and how to control it, zero trust models and that sort of thing, security of data through encryption. So even if someone gains access to your database, they can't make sense of the data. These are all great mitigation strategies. The threat, though, is something that I think has escalated over the last 9 to 12 months during COVID in specific industries. So it's a concern. I don't think enough companies are thinking about the risk to their data adequately.
So we've talked about zero trust a few times. Alex, you've touched on it. Jonathan, if we could simplify it for our audience, and what would it mean to you if you had to explain it in very succinct terms and how it impacts the customers that we serve?
Okay, sure. So Zero Trust was born in 2009, and it posited the idea that you shouldn't trust traffic behind that firewall any more than traffic outside that firewall. And it gained a lot of traction in the pandemic because most of us are actually now outside that firewall. So it's basically the idea of need to know access, that only the right people or entities using the right devices are allowed to have access to the right workloads and applications, network resources, right? And that we're going to log and monitor everything. And then I would add, find the final disposition of what was accessed. So Jonathan's given access to the mail server. What did he access? And what did he do with that data and information from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective? Now that sounds intuitively elegant and simple, right? All you have to do is identify, authenticate, inspect, validate, and log and monitor everything. Now, the challenge, of course, is when you do that at speed and scale, and you're looking at millions of simultaneous connections and requests for network access. And so in a nutshell, Zero Trust is all about making sure that the right people or things are accessing the right applications, and that we're going to log and monitor everything and look for anomalous behavior. That's the essence of what Zero Trust is. The backdrop against that is that's going to be the central pillar in cybersecurity moving forward. But we'll talk about this as we talk about SASE and SD-WAN and really how security needs to be thought of in a converged way with both security and networking. Because to touch on that last question, the big change that the pandemic really brought on was twofold. One, the business outcome and the mission outcome are just as important as the customer or end user experience. And so the cybersecurity aspect delivers on the business outcome, right? But it's SD-WAN that determines the optimized network access methodology that delivers the customer experience. And so I would add, as we think about security moving forward, the discussion is both the networking piece and the securities piece working in tandem rather than separate items.
Thank you. Well done. Alex, what would you add?
I'll add to that and say that another component of Zero Trust that makes it whole is it's equally important to remove access when it's no longer necessary. So a lot of people think about the adding access part so that we can control who has access to what, but a lot of companies forget that when an employee changes roles within the company, picks up a new job, we oftentimes don't remove access, and then our Zero Trust methodology is sort of violated over time, even though it feels like we're doing the right thing. So agree with Jonathan completely in what it is. He did a great job explaining it, but to maintain the integrity of it, we got to remove that access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add to that as well is that, you know, while Zero Trust as a concept really started on the network side, it actually expands into much broader, even into sort of the application side of things as well. And it really comes down to identity management, and that's sort of the way you're describing it as well. Is you know, you need to have a real understanding of the context of the identities that you're dealing with. And if you think about it, you know, all security comes down to in a nutshell is, ensuring that only appropriate activities occur, right? And in order to ensure that something is appropriate, you kind of need to know who the actor is, as well as what the resource that they're trying to act upon and what action they're trying to take. And so by looking at this in a context of understanding the actor, that's really all about the identity, knowing who they are, knowing the context of where they're coming from, what kind of information you might have about them at that time, as well as historically. So behavioral aspects can play into this as well. And so by having that understanding, it simplifies the decision making for the authentication or authorization points that you're taking with these resources. And so now you can start to do things like, if you have that context well understood and if you're tracking it over time, you can do things like continuous authentication or continuous authorization and doing it in real time. So because you have to be able to do this at scale. Otherwise, everybody's, really going to be frustrated with all of the controls you put in place. So they want to have that access, but you want to make sure it's secure access. And go ahead.
And that's why that's great points. I was going to say the hardest thing about Zero Trust in many ways is not the technology part. It's the first part. It's the data process classification and understanding who owns what, its criticality, and then the roles, right? That need to know basis part.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And so having aspects of governance, being able to have the right decision makers involved in deciding how entitlements are established for these identities, and that all ties back to the context of what they're trying to do as part of their jobs. Do they need to have access to this kind of sensitive data in order to perform their job function, for example? And so yeah, I view this as a continuum as well, is that this, you need to have all of these aspects all working in tandem to really deliver a full Zero Trust model.
Thank you. Knowing that a lot of organizations through this time frame in COVID have had furloughed employees they've had to let go, what advice would you have to ensuring that cybersecurity is at top of mind for C-suite, for technology leaders, and ensuring that's a priority in the organization, even though there's been many changes from a staffing perspective and priorities? What's your advice?
Well, one thing, I'll take a stab at this first, but it becomes such an issue, especially if you weren't prepared for the remote work environment, and you may have distributed resources like laptops or other devices that have specific access attributed to them, to individuals that then later on you decide to let go. And because things aren't as centralized, and because you're not having them within the office experience, it's that much more critical to be able to turn off that access. And so that comes back to an identity management problem. But you also have these devices that are not under your control anymore. And so how are you going to go through the collection of those, make sure that the data that is present on those aren't copied off somewhere else? I mean, there's a whole litany of challenges that stem from this when you're not in an effective path towards addressing these kinds of remote challenges. So part of this comes is that if for an organization, if you weren't prepared, you need to really start thinking this thing through, and really thinking about what kinds of processes and procedures do you really want to enact in on an ongoing basis, so you can have more control and ensure that you can facilitate that kind of remote work while also not opening yourself to undue risk from that perspective. But at the same time, then it's a matter of how do you get these processes enacted in an effective way. One of the baseline absolutely is, like I said earlier, with identity management, you need to be able to shut off access to any of these resources that are remote, that are online, that they would have access to otherwise. That's probably the core of the problem. But with all the distribution of everything going on, that's the other element that really needs to be taken care of.
Let me build on that. I love the topic of remote work when it comes to cybersecurity. We just launched a new solution we call Remote Home Secure. It's a solution for our partners to leverage with customers. And what we found through delivering this is that companies are just not thinking about the risks of data access from remote employees from home, even though we've been doing it forever, from hotel rooms and as we travel around. But now that everybody's at home, we're finding that employees are using personal laptops for work stuff and letting their corporate laptops sit there collecting dust. Personal laptop doesn't necessarily have endpoint security on it, doesn't necessarily have a VPN client, connect securely to cloud services. We're finding that employees don't even know what firmware is to update on their home router, which become compromised very quickly and can become part of botnets. There's just a general lack of cyber understanding again with employees working remote. And it puts the company at risk because a lot of people are bringing that data home and then they're storing it on personal box accounts and Dropbox accounts and not maybe a corporate OneDrive. So companies, I think at the C-suite level, it's a really important topic to get a hold on your risk factor. At the end of the day, cybersecurity is all about risk mitigation and risk assessment. So analyzing exactly for your industry, your type of business, where you focus, what your primary risks are as a company, prioritizing those risks and deciding what you have budget to afford to mitigate risks with. Whether that's cyber insurance to buying tools and products from Micro Focus or from Fortinet. It's a C-suite topic to figure out where are you going to put your limited dollars. Is it for tools to help with home remote? Is it for cloud risk and sprawl? It's a big challenge.
Yeah, I would only take a slightly different tact, is that where we are right now, it's after the initial adrenaline rush and we're kind of stable from what I'm hearing. And a lot of teams are now thinking about what's next, what's around the curve, because remote working is going to be a standard business model going forward. So the notion that the new normal is going to be remote working in many cases supported, and that there's going to be more adoption of cloud computing. So it's an opportunity to think about what your business is going to look like coming out of this pandemic. How much of the workloads will shift to the cloud? And how are you going to secure that? And so it's an opportunity to consolidate as we think about technologies and services. It's an opportunity to say, hey, is there any way we can reduce the amount of box sprawl that we have? Is there any way we can reduce the amount of complexity by consolidating functions, if you will? And how do we do that and improve performance and reduce costs and help the business at the same time? That's the type of decisions that I'm seeing right now. Most everyone has shifted to secure their remote working capabilities, but what they haven't really done is figured out exactly what their cloud infrastructure is going to look like and how their business model is going to change in the next 2 years.
So shifting a little bit around GDPR, and it's been getting some traction in Europe, enforcement, et cetera, around data. From your opinions, should the US have greater oversight in protecting our consumer sensitive data?
So I think yes. I mean, most organizations, if you're functioning in any kind of international capacity already, are facing this challenge today. But from a perspective of, and again, just all the things that we were just talking about, all of the aspects of really understanding where your data is, knowing what kind of data it is, what classification, what sensitivity level it is, identifying what kinds of controls you can put in place around that speaks to this problem. So putting in better guidance, putting in requirements to ensure that this data is protected, and that the responsibility I mentioned earlier, data stewardship, sort of putting that as the goal, making sure that everybody is striving towards being good data stewards, is, I think, paramount in this environment in particular. So I think it's good practice no matter what. But and we've talked about in the past aspects around consumer identity and personal identifiable information and protecting that. But it's more than that. If you're really enacting a proper data stewardship program, then you're not collecting unnecessary data. You're not becoming a repository that's just waiting to be compromised. You're putting that data to purpose for what you're actually trying to achieve, and you're being accountable for it.
Yeah.
And you're also, making sure that you have all of the right procedures in place for how you collect the data, how you protect the data that you keep, and how you dispose of the data that you don't need. And I think all of that needs to be really put in a place where we can consistently be relying on that from our organizations within the U.S.
Yeah, great points on data stewardship. I like that approach. In fact, when I advise leadership teams, I say, look, if you look at GDPR and you look at things like the California Consumer Privacy Act, and you look at the various state regs like the New York State Financial Regulations Part 500, there's a phrase, a term of art that's in most of them, and it says, you will undertake a reasonable level of care in the identification and management of risk. And so reasonable care is the standard by which we're really going to be graded upon. And the challenge about that is there is no prescriptive, there's one prescriptive definition of what reasonable care is, and that came out of California. And the definition was this Center for Internet Security's 20 critical cybersecurity controls, right? But it behooves all security professionals to help their organizations understand their risk posture, their risk tolerance, and how much they can absorb and how much they're going to try to insure against, and then to take a reasonable amount of care in the management of those risks. And so when you take a look at that in the aftermath of any major data breach or disruption, there are questions that they're always asked. It's, what did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? And the last question, was it reasonable? And that's the advice I would give leadership teams, is to take a look at what you're doing today. And do you believe that would pass the reasonable person standard? Because that's the test based on English common law, right? So what would you do? Would a reasonable person do, knowing what they know when they know it? So yeah, and that takes the onus back on our shoulders, right? Because we have to describe what is reasonable. Yeah.
Alex.
Yeah, I call that the sniff test. I think that's pass the sniff test.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with what they're saying. I would add, to the original question of do I think that we should have greater oversight here in the U.S. I would reword it and say I believe we should have better consistency across the U.S. So GDPR was a good step in Europe to try to bring some clarity around and protections for consumers and their data. In the US, as Jonathan pointed out, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act, we have the New York security regulation around financial services, but it's a bit of the Wild West still here on a state-by-state basis. And so NIST has come out with some standards to try to be helpful in practical ways companies can protect their data. But we really do need a more consistent federal story, in my opinion, that everyone can rally behind, so that companies aren't having to try to figure out the differences in all the regulations, depending on what state you do business in. I think that's ultimately going to be too expensive for companies to be able to handle and afford reasonably. That part doesn't pass the sniff test for me. So
yeah,
I do think
couldn't agree more.
Consistency would be super helpful.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's much easier to adhere to one set of guidance rather than 50.
Right.
So at what point do organizations start looking at outsourcing their security operations, their management of security, to really reduce their risk? Where do you see that threshold living?
I'll start with that one. I think it has a lot to do with several factors. So companies like SMB, mid-market companies who don't have the budget to do it themselves. A lot of companies literally can't find cybersecurity people in order to staff those operation centers if they wanted to, right? So they're still expecting almost 3 million open unfilled job positions by the end of this year in cybersecurity globally. So companies who can't find that can leverage a managed service or a remote SOC capability to provide that for them. If you don't have the budget to hire and train and buy all the equipment and do all that stuff, you can outsource, which is oftentimes paid on more of a consumption model. I think that the ability to monitor your infrastructure is too important not to do it all. I think that companies need to find a way. We have so much data now coming out of our devices and our cloud services and our endpoint devices. And so it is important that we have an operations capability of some type. Maybe that's a security operations center, maybe not. but it is something that companies need to figure out. And if you can't afford to do it, outsourcing it to a managed service provider is a good, efficient way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, look, it's interesting because cybersecurity is often said to be a team sport, and I say cybersecurity is not a DIY exercise, and so it's not a question of if you're going to outsource. I think just about everyone is going to outsource some portion of their security requirements, even the largest organizations. In fact, one cyber leader once told me, said, Jonathan, have you ever noticed the largest data breaches often occurred in organizations with the largest benches and the deepest budgets? And so no one can really do it on their own. And that what you're seeing in the managed services market are a plethora of services, everything from fully outsourced managed SOC, traditional MSS services, event monitoring, there's managed detection and response, there's SOC as a service, there's SIEM as a service, right? So I think what you really have to do is talk to your partners, talk to the folks we have on this call to help determine what's your core competency. Is it really going to be running and operating and monitoring a SIEM or analytics platform? Do you want to do that, or do you want to focus on incident response? Or what exactly are your core capabilities against your risk model, right? And then find an appropriate partner. One thing to consider, no matter what you do, whether in-house or fully outsourced, is that you own that risk. You can't transfer that. No matter what happens, you are still liable and responsible for that. Now, you can bring on other ways of delivering services and bring your partners in, but ultimately you are the risk owner. And so you can't get rid of that. You can't buy insurance against that. You own that risk, and you have to manage that risk accordingly. But yeah, I think all of us at some point will outsource some portion of our capabilities, because it's just far too complex today. Just by reference alone, if you were going to build a SOC 24/7, 365 days, talking 9 to 15 people, fully staffed, it's about $1.5 million a year just to operate it, let alone building the infrastructure out, whether it's software as a service or not. So running SOCs and managing security operations are a very extraordinarily expensive thing. But we're going to have to figure out what our core capabilities are, where the gaps are, and what's the best way of filling that out.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. I also feel that, there's an aspect to this that no matter what you do, you're going to end up having some kind of a blended hybrid model.
Yeah.
There's going to be some things that you feel that you need to maintain as your core competency, but also from a perspective of skill set and maintaining that's a real challenge. And so I think it is going to be kind of a mix, and identifying where you can, leverage services that you can just consume for certain aspects of sort of the spectrum, if you will. But there's also another aspect of this too, is that the products are actually improving. And so there is a concerted effort across the board, at least from what I've been seeing, around simplification of the products, leveraging things like unsupervised machine learning, other aspects of behavioral analytics to help really narrow the scope down, so the skill set isn't quite as heavy, and you can get meaningful results, at a much easier level, because the intelligence is being put in place to really make this much easier. So I think it's a combination. I think that aspects of looking at what kinds of service providers can provide areas that you don't have critical core competency in, but also looking at products that can really help you really have a good handle on what's going on, and be able to really be aware of that risk. Because I think that's the other aspect, is you want to have that visibility so you can make better decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So what advice would each of you have to our listeners around just some best practice advice around cybersecurity, and just your view as an expert? If you were in the consumer's position, what would you provide advice?
Okay. Sure. I'll start off.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things that I would do. One, best practices involve security awareness training, a rigorous approach around that. And these are the top 4 things in my research would suggest that you will improve your security maturity, your posture by some 75%. The first part is security awareness training. The irony and the paradox of security awareness training is that going into the pandemic, we regularly saw our staffs about 4% failing, meaning that 4% of the employees were constantly clicking on illegitimate links and failing awareness training. The paradox is that in the middle of the pandemic, the research came out that suggested that number had risen to 22%, and that amongst the respondents were cybersecurity companies. It was just that even cybersecurity pros working outside the perimeter were failing, right? So security awareness training is key. Multi-factor authentication, because that is, I don't know how, I would say this till I'm blue in the face, but we've been talking about multi-factor authentication for years. That will also improve your security posture by 25%, based on that research from my past experience. Third is a rigorous approach around web application vulnerability management, right? And then the fourth element is, I think you need to have a technology platform like our Fortinet security fabric that is broad, it's integrated, it's automated, so that you can address the known knowns. What I mean by the known knowns, here's the statistics that's really troubling me, and it's been true for the last at least decade now. Some 99% of all vulnerabilities exploited were known for at least a year, meaning the signature was available, right? And so we're failing on the most basic of things in cybersecurity. And if you think that we're spending $250 billion on network security per year, and that statistic has been true for 10 years, it tells you that let's just get the basics done first as a baseline, and then begin moving on to these more advanced threats. So yeah, and then from a consumer level, my advice is this: get yourself a credit freeze, not credit monitoring, but a credit freeze, because that is what negates your exposure. Having worked in the US government, having held those clearances, having been compromised during the OPM breach, it's all public information now about me, I live my life in the open. Get a credit freeze so that even if they have all of your information, there's no way of monetizing it, right? Credit monitoring only tells you when someone's doing something nefarious with your data. A credit freeze prohibits or makes it impossible for them to monetize your information, negating that risk, that liability, right?
Yeah, mine would, I like the way you divide it up into kind of business and personal. So my business priorities I would leave behind are, number one, as Jonathan said, security awareness training cannot be overstated enough. I think that's incredibly important. It would prevent so many challenges, because one of the most popular ways bad guys get into your network is through email, phishing scams. And so training employees on how to avoid clicking that link would mitigate a lot of threat in the environment. The second would be around leveraging automation. Our networks are too complex with endpoint and cloud security and IoT devices for us to think we can manage all the data and feedback we get from devices in our environment and applications reasonably on our own. With a SOC and a person, a human, we have to leverage automation platforms to automate the response. If we detect that a device has ransomware going on it, we need to isolate that device, disconnect it from the network, and notify someone to go fix it right away, instantly. So the third piece of advice I would give is you must patch your environment on a regular basis. Patch management's been around for 30 years, 40 years, but it's still not done well, to Jonathan's point a minute ago. Testing those patches, doing them regularly, paying attention is super important. And on a personal level, for consumers and for employees of companies, I would say that password management is an incredibly important thing for you to focus on, and your family members. Using a password manager like LastPass or 1Password, or there's many of them out there. I use LastPass, and I can't imagine not having it. I have 450 accounts in there. I can't learn all those, and you want to have a unique password for every single account you leverage, so that if I, as a bad guy, hack into some online e-tailer where you bought a pair of jeans and you used a simple password, if I compromise their database, which is probably not very difficult, not a lot of security, if you're using the same password and email address for your username in that site, and I now have those credentials, I'm going to go try every one of your bank and PayPal and Amazon and eBay, and I'm going to try all your investment accounts, hoping you're using the same password there too. So use a unique password on all your accounts, store them all in a password manager, and that will greatly reduce your threat profile.
Thank you. Nick?
And I couldn't agree more with the points that both Jonathan and Alex have made. I think that it's really good advice all across the board. I would say that one thing that I would qualify is that there's an aspect of this to how do you get started and how do you continually improve. And so organizations really should start looking at this as a maturity model, and that it's also an iterative set of processes that they need to really start to embrace and adopt. And with the mindset that you're not going to be able to prevent everything. You're not going to be able to stop all bad things from happening. But as we were talking about earlier about, you're really trying to manage risk, but what that really means is you're trying to establish cyber resiliency. You're trying to put yourself in a position as an organization that you can react, effectively, that you can have enough in place that you can weather the storm and continually improve. So the best way to think about this is, really look at how you, employ your cybersecurity practices. Now, there are best practices, in many areas. NIST cybersecurity framework is a good example. You could think of that as a model for iterating and improving. But the general idea is that you're really getting a handle on what your current state is, identifying where you're at most exposure, at most risk, where your sensitive resources are. Start to implement and put in place the right protective controls to minimize, the potential, for any kind of damage that could be done. So this is following least, privilege practices, which goes along with this whole philosophy of zero trust. Making sure that you're checking and verifying along the way, and ensuring the right access controls are part of those protective controls, but then also implementing the right detective controls, excuse me, so that way you're monitoring and you're watching what's going on and you're being able to be responsive to the changing dynamics of what's going on in the environment. And by looking at that and considering that as basically an iterative process, you can continually evolve your ability to react and to respond. So you can actually get to a point where you're really intelligently adapting to the dynamics that's coming at you all the time. And I think that looking at this from a perspective of what we've had to deal with over the last little while with the pandemic, is just one example of if you have this kind of process in place, you can be much more prepared for dealing with these kinds of unknowns that can crop up and bite you when you're not expecting it.
Thank you so much. I can't thank, and PDS can't thank our panelists for participating today. It was so wonderful to hear your perspectives, gain insight into your knowledge, and to help just continuously educate as we step through the cybersecurity journey that exists. So thank you, everyone. If you want any more information regarding cybersecurity and how PDS and our partners can assist, please contact your account director, and we will assist with any type of collaboration and journey within your cybersecurity platform. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara.
Mm-hmm.